Today is October 24th, 2024, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. One of the reasons why I decided to pursue a vocation as a lay Dominican was because when I looked at the four pillars of the lay Dominican life, I felt like I was already living a life that showed many similarities to the lay Dominican um, charism, the four pillars of the lay Dominican life. These four pillars are prayer, study, apostolate, and community. Before I became a Catholic, back in 2003, 2004, I was preparing to enter an Episcopalian seminary. I had been invited, was recommended, had visited the seminary, and was finally responding to a call that I had sensed, that others had communicated to me, that I was encouraged to pursue throughout my 20s, which was to serve the Lord in some way through the Christian ministry. I attended a number of different churches from the time that I first had interest in Christianity when I was around 19 years old. I went from evangelical church to Baptist church to Reformed Baptist church to what's known as classical Anglicanism or Reformed Episcopalianism in the United States. And I was very happy, very comfortable as a Reformed Episcopalian, and was preparing, as I said, to go to seminary and serve as an Episcopalian rector. But it was when I began to ask questions about ordination that things started to seem shaky, and that eventually led to my conversion to Catholicism, because I became persuaded of the necessity of the papacy and apostolic succession. But as an Episcopalian, I had embraced the liturgical religion that's found in and through the Book of Common Prayer. And I had gone beyond that and found an older book called the Anglican Breviary, which was an Anglican, as strange as this may sound, an Anglican divine office. And so I found this book, and as I asked around, almost no one that I knew anything about it, and I felt like I had some sort of secret treasure. This idea that I could have my entire devotional life directed by a single source for prayer, for hymns, and so on. And so I began to pray, in addition to the Book of Common Prayer, which to this day I love and to some degree miss. But I began to pray the Anglican divine office. And so when I became a Catholic in 2005, 2006, I was already comfortable with liturgical worship and with liturgical prayer. So as a Catholic, I was a bit odd, but I was attracted to the orderly religious life for some time. Even though I was married as a Protestant, I was attracted to there being some sort of rule, some sort of regular life. And when I became a Catholic, I learned about the Liturgy of the Hours and obviously the liturgy of the church, and was very happy and very comfortable settling in as a Catholic. I was always very interested in prayer. As I said, I prayed morning and evening prayer from the Book of Common Prayer as an Anglican, and then moved on into the other hours, the other offices of the liturgy. And again, that was before I became a Catholic. I loved prayer. I loved regular daily devotion. I loved reciting the Psalms. I loved learning um, prayers of the church that had been composed and used for centuries. I could see the benefit of that form of a devotional life, and became a Catholic with that already established or being established in my life. Study, the second pillar, again, I was already zealous for study, and I've told this story, I think, on a couple occasions. But I learned about the virtue of study again while I was a Protestant, because I had a drive for study because I wanted to understand the scriptures, especially thinking about my possible future as a minister and preacher. I wanted to know the scriptures. I wanted to be mighty in the scriptures. And so I began to study. That's when I became interested in classical studies, in ancient history, in the classical languages, and so on. But I didn't know how to study, but I sensed that I needed to study greatly. And I started to pick up little things. For example, even before that, when I was in the first church that I had attended, an evangelical church that I enjoyed because they studied the scriptures together. You can complain about a million things, but one thing was certain, and it's that they studied the Bible. And the pastor of the church taught through the Bible, verse by verse, going through entire books of the scriptures, and I really loved that. And this pastor, this evangelical pastor, worked very hard in his ministry. And I remember having time to just talk with him um, and look into his eyes, and I could just see his eyes were bloodshot. I could see that he was tired. And I remember admiring him because I could tell that he was a man who worked very hard. He had a very, very busy, influential ministry, studied and taught very diligently. And I could just see in his face an exhaustion, a sense that he pushed himself to exhaustion for the study and the teaching that he did. And I remember seeing that in his eyes and saying to myself, I need to be like that. I need to become like that. I need to push myself. And I had grown up playing sports. I knew all about self-mastery and discipline and pushing myself. I knew all about that, but I had never applied that mentality to study until I met this one evangelical pastor. And so I started to study more diligently, um, working really hard in studies. During college, I spent all of my time in either working to pay my bills or in the library on campus. I had a spot down in the lowest floor of the library where I would just camp out and study. And I was doing pretty good. My grades were good. I was learning how to study. And I was also learning about important Christians from history. And again, this was all Protestant, but I was learning about different Christians, about some of the Puritan divines, as they were called, theologians who were among the Puritans, who were very well educated men, very good teachers, very good preachers, even though their teaching was obviously faulty. They were very, very good students, very diligent workers, and I admired them at that point in my life. And one that I admired the most was actually from the area where I lived. I lived in central New Jersey, and spent a lot of time between Rutgers and Princeton campuses, from New Brunswick down to Princeton. And I learned that one of the authors that I really liked, Jonathan Edwards, was actually president at Princeton University and was buried at Princeton University, or in Princeton. And I went and found his grave in Princeton, and I was really excited to have that connection because I really liked this preacher and writer, Jonathan Edwards, and I could stand at his grave. And at that point in my life, that was pretty cool. That was an inspiring experience there in Princeton. But I loved the detail and the learning that Jonathan Edwards preached and wrote with. I should say wrote with because all I had were sermons in written form. But as I was studying his biography, I learned about his personal life and habits and discipline. And I learned that he studied for 13 hours a day. Back in the early 1700s, he studied for 13 hours a day. And I remember when I first read that, that was when I realized what a real life of study consisted of. I realized what level I had to get myself to. And I realized that even though I was doing well in studies, I was nowhere near being a serious student, historically speaking. And I had that number in my mind, 13 hours a day. And I would just think about that. That's like getting started at 9 o'clock in the morning and studying until 10 o'clock at night. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. The discipline, the strength, the commitment, the focus that would be needed to do that is really, it seemed like it would be supernatural. And so I began to study more and study more. And, eventually got into classical studies, as I said, and by the diligence of my study, got into the research of the classical liberal arts and the history of education. And obviously the Classical Liberal Arts Academy now is sort of the fruit, the ongoing fruit of my life of study. And study is my full-time job and has been for almost my entire adult life. And so I love study. There's nothing else I desire to do in the world than study. Even if I'm out on the farm working, I've got audiobooks playing and I'm thinking and listening and talking to myself and writing notes in my phone. I'm always studying and thinking. I love it. I love the pursuit of wisdom. And so again, the second pillar of the lay Dominican life is study. And when I learned that, liturgical prayer, study, and then the third was apostolate. And as apostolate, I already had established and was running a classical Catholic educational program. And so I already had an apostolate. And the last pillar was community. And honestly, that was the one thing that I didn't have. The one thing that I was really longing for was community. I wanted like-minded community. Now, I understood as a Catholic that the parish is my community, my Christian community. And I've been in the same parish with my wife and children for 20 years now. I think I can say that I'm a faithful member of the parish community. My wife certainly is, probably more so than I am. But I've had a good relationship with pastors that have served our parish. I have good relationships with the people in my parish. But there's not much community because I don't have much in common. Outside of the sacraments, I really don't have much in common with the people in my parish. I just sort of keep to myself. No one in the parish really knows what I do. They know I work in education, but that's about all they know. There's no way for the people who live in Monroe, North Carolina, just like my parents, there's no way for them to understand what I actually do. And so I had sacramental community, but I didn't have any real community with people who share my interests, my work ethic, my desires, and so on. It was always just a private thing. Thankfully, I've always had my wife who, to some degree, shares those things with me, but in a very different degree. And so I always lacked community in that sense. And so when I thought about the lay Dominican community, I thought to myself, maybe this is that community. Maybe this is where that community is found. And when we began to attend lay Dominican meetings as inquirers the very first year, I was amazed at that reality. I was amazed to see that these people shared my interest, my zeal. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had friends. I felt like I actually had brothers and sisters in Christ who I had everything in common with. It was a very strange experience. There's one story, I tell this often, so forgive me if you listen to my talks and have heard this before, but passage in the Old Testament that I've always found interesting is when Abraham meets Melchizedek in the Old Testament, because God spoke to Abraham and revealed true religion to Abraham, made promises to Abraham, and I would imagine that Abraham often felt alone and isolated in this religion. And then one day he runs into this man, Melchizedek, who is identified as a priest of the Most High God. And you can imagine these two men meeting, these two men in whom God's grace has been working. God has led these two men separately to the same place, not just geographically, but also spiritually. He's led them to the same place, and when they meet each other, I can imagine this sort of mysterious experience where they listen to each other and see each other and have a feeling towards one another that neither of them has with others. And it's that sort of a feeling when I think about Abraham meeting Melchizedek. I don't know if any artwork has been done showing that meeting. If so, it's probably quite interesting. But sometime when I met these Dominicans, that's how I felt. I felt that these people have come from all different places, and I've come from a different place, and yet here we are, all at the same place. And it was very strange experience, and I felt like it was a confirmation that this was where God was leading me, because the community was just so authentic and comfortable and complete. Just such a beautiful community of Catholic people, rare people I never met anywhere else. And so the four pillars, prayer, study, apostolate, and community, all came together for me. And that was how I sensed my lay Dominican vocation. That became very clear. The same was true for my wife, and we both became lay Dominicans. So I've always been focused on these four pillars of the lay Dominican life, because they give my life so much order and focus and help me to avoid all of the distractions and chaos. I constantly go back to the four pillars: prayer, study, apostolate, and community, and say these are the four necessary things. And I'd like to talk a little bit, as the title of the talk suggested, I'd like to talk about study. I'd like to talk about study because I think it's something that's not understood in modern culture. Um, Again, I mentioned before that when I was reading the life of Jonathan Edwards and I learned about his discipline in study, the long hours that he spent studying, that's when I first had a sense of the standard of what being a historically significant student must really look like. I think about stories of the saints like St. Dominic and St. Thomas Aquinas and others, and we learn about their extraordinary studies when they were young, even when they were children. Extraordinary historical students. And I realized that in order to accomplish the kinds of things with respect to study that need to be accomplished to really influence our own generation, the level of study has to be understood to be far beyond what we think of when we talk of study. It's one thing to study to get a grade. It's one thing to study to get a diploma. It's one thing to study to get a degree. But to study to actually gain wisdom and to master the arts and sciences is a completely different level, a completely different life. And even that is just learning about things, learning about other men's answers to questions in history, other men's solutions to problems. And we can talk about the accomplishments of other men. We can talk about the accomplishments of Pythagoras and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Cicero. We can talk about the accomplishments of Christian church fathers and theologians and missionaries. We can talk about all of these problems and councils that have met and answers to controversial questions that have been established. And we can study and learn about the learning of other men, the solutions of other men, but we still haven't reached a level where we begin to solve the problems of our own generation, where we become the wise men, the influential men who actually take on the problems of their own time and solve them, solve the riddles of their own generation, solve the problems of their own generation. That's a completely different level. And so there are all these levels, from studying to get a good grade on a test, to getting a diploma, to getting a degree, maybe to becoming successful in a field of work, to learning the true faith, to learning true philosophy, and then, as I said, to actually solve the philosophical or controversial dilemmas of one's own generation, which is the greatest achievement of all through study. And so I've always known that there are levels and levels and levels above where I'm at. The life of Jonathan Edwards made that clear, but I didn't understand how to actually pursue that, how to actually study. And it wasn't until I learned about the 7 liberal arts and the philosophical sciences and Catholic theology that I began to learn what and how to actually study at that level. Aristotle says that all necessary things are painful, and among the necessary things he lists, he includes study. He says that study is a necessary thing and it is a painful thing. Study is painful. But he says study is painful because it's contrary to our nature, contrary to our fallen nature, I can say, as a Christian. But study is contrary to human nature. It's it's heroic and virtuous, and consequently it's painful. It's difficult for us. And yet Aristotle says, and I believe this was in the Rhetoric, he says that when we do things that are necessary and painful, they're painful initially because they're contrary to our nature, and we're averse to them. But after we begin to do them, and we continue to do them, and we discipline ourselves and continue to do them, those things become our habits, and that difficulty goes away and is replaced with a pleasure in those things. And I can say that at this point in my life, I enjoy the pleasure of study. And I have for a long time. I take pleasure in even rigorous study, just because I've had so much experience in study, and I've become accustomed to the discipline of study, and I can now, at my age, study for hours and hours and hours a day from the time I wake up until I finally fall asleep. Now, as I was going through young adulthood, I was the only person I knew who studied the way that I studied. And so I always struggled because I just thought I was strange. I thought I was going overboard. I was being ridiculous. And I found, but I loved to study. And I found that I could actually stay up all night and study through the night, even to the morning, and just keep going and go without sleep and go to work the next day. And I felt fine. I could study through the night, around the clock, go multiple days without sleep and feel perfectly fine. But I used to explain that away and just say it was genetic, because my mother was a person who was always up very late until 1 o'clock in the morning or so, and she'd get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. And so I just attributed that ability to work around the clock to my mother. And I said, oh, I'm just like my mother. You know, she doesn't sleep either. But as I began to grow in the Christian life and read saint biographies and learn more about the practical lives of saints, the real lives of saints, I started to see things in the lives of the saints that became interesting. I began to learn about the Catholic life and realize that there were some things that I had sort of stumbled upon out of necessity in my own experience that were essential parts of the Catholic life that Catholics don't talk about very much. Catholics don't talk very much about fasting, for example, just to give an illustration. We may talk about giving something up at Lent. We may talk about not eating meat on Fridays, but we don't hear Catholics talking much about fasting. And another thing, another discipline we don't hear Catholics talking about very much is keeping vigil. Keeping vigil, again, there's sort of a modern idea of vigil, which means, going to an Easter vigil, right? Going to Mass the evening before a great celebration in the liturgical calendar. We'll say, oh, are you going to the Easter vigil? Or are you going to, pray evening prayer on the vigil of some feast in the calendar? There's this idea of vigil being a celebration in the evening, doing something the evening before. And that's true, of course. But you see, that notion of the vigil is comparable to the no meat on Friday, give something up during Lent idea of fasting. They're sort of similar. But that's really not what saints meant when they talked about fasting. And that's not what saints meant when they talked about keeping vigil. In history, keeping vigil meant staying up sacrificing sleep for the sake of study. That's what keeping vigil meant, whether it was for prayer or for meditation or for some sort of theological or philosophical study. Keeping vigil meant giving up sleep and using those quiet hours of the night for study. And the symbol of keeping vigil was the owl. If you think back to Greek mythology, the goddess Athena was the goddess of wisdom. And she was represented in mythology by the owl. And the idea of the owls are awake through the night. They're nocturnal creatures. They're awake. And it's thought of the owl that they have superior knowledge to other animals and to people as well, because they're up through the night and they see all things. And so this idea of the vigil was represented by the owl, and the hours of the night were spoken of as the hours of wisdom, when wise men sit alone in quiet, when the entire town and the house is silent in sleep. That's when those who are philosophers, those who love wisdom, that's when they get to work and they have the opportunity to study, to put in intense study for extended periods of time, and they do it at the expense of their sleep. I've learned about this or run into this again and again throughout my Catholic life. One example where I learned about the importance of keeping vigil for the sake of study was in the encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, I believe it was, on the restoration of Christian philosophy. He talks about the greatness of the scholastic philosophers and, of course, about St. Thomas Aquinas. And he talks about the great works of St. Thomas Aquinas. And, when we look at the Summa Theologica, when we look at St. Thomas's commentaries on sacred scripture, his commentaries on the philosophical works of Aristotle, we look at his works and we realize that he died at age 49. He died at 49. The works that he did, the incredible works that he produced, were all completed before he was 50. And we may wonder, we may flip through the Summa Theologica or flip through the Summa Contra Gentiles or flip through his commentaries on Aristotle and just say, how in the world did he get this stuff done? No electricity, no computers. How in the world did he get this done? And as I was reading that encyclical on the restoration of Christian philosophy, I saw that when St. Thomas Aquinas was praised, when the works of St. Thomas Aquinas were praised, it was said that he had accomplished his great works by constant vigils. In other words, he stayed up and studied and worked through the night. Recently, actually just this past week, I was reading a brief life of St. Dominic in a book that we're reading for our lay Dominican group called the Selected Writings of Early Dominicans. And I read about St. Dominic that when the community had first organized, I think it was St. Dominic, but he had granted permission to the members of the community to stay up for the sake of studies. That was an option. They could stay up for the sake of study. And so this idea of vigil being staying up through the night, and the idea of vigil has to do with the watchman who stays up and keeps watch. Such a beautiful image, such a beautiful image of the intellectual man, the spiritually minded man, while everyone else sleeps, staying up and keeping watch as the guardian, as the watchman of the community, and seeing how that character of the watchman then relates to the work of study. Really beautiful. And you see what's happening as I continue to think about this. There's more and more connections that begin to come together. For example, Saint Ignatius of Loyola taught that the devil is a sophist. He's a deceiver. He's like a fox or a wolf. He's fraudulent. He's a liar. And here is the wise man up in the middle of the night studying, untying the knots of the devil's deceptions, as it were, and protecting the people. It becomes a beautiful image of the role of the man who seeks wisdom. And a wonderful example of that, the greatest example of that, would be our Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane. We see this discipline of the vigil on display, modeled for us in the life of Christ. We see him in the hour of his greatest trial, which became the hour of his greatest triumph. We see him about to face his great trial, the trial, his passion. And we see him urging his disciples to rise up and pray. Rise up and pray. And we see our Lord fighting this spiritual battle, fighting this spiritual warfare, and doing so by means of vigil. He's up through the night. And what is he doing? He's praying and sacrificing the comforts of sleep for the safety of his soul. And we have in the Garden of Gethsemane this image of the vigilant spiritual leader, this vigilant saint, seeking his salvation rather than his comfort, and urging his disciples to do likewise, and we see them not doing so, but sleeping instead. And so I've always had this unfriendly relationship with sleep because I've always seen it as the enemy of my study. It's hard to study during the day because we have to do business, we have to provide for ourselves, we have to engage with the market, and much of what we do is determined by what others do. And so we've got to put in our hours, as it were. We've got to put in our business hours during the work week and get our business done. And then we've got family obligations and other things to take care of. And finally, the kids start to settle down, the house starts to quiet down, and we're tired from a day's work, and the thought of going and throwing ourselves onto that bed, sometimes there's no better feeling in the world than just to lay down and just feel all of the weariness of the day, just be absorbed by the mattress and pillow in the dark room. But we know that if we're going to study, that's it. That's the only time that there is. That's the only time that exists. And so we've got to choose to keep vigil. We've got to choose to stay up, to sacrifice sleep for the sake of study. And so you can see, I think, how all of these different threads came to be woven together and have helped me to really understand what is meant by study in the Catholic life. Now, that's sort of the how of study. But the other question that's really not known today is the what of study. The what. Now we can be like Protestants and say, well, we know we're supposed to study the sacred scriptures, and that of course is true. We need to study the sacred scriptures, but study and prayer can't be separated. We study to pray and we pray to study. Those two actions are two sides of the same coin. And so the Liturgy of the Hours and the Rosary, the study of Scripture, the study of the Catechism, they're all woven together into one action, really, one life. Our studies and our prayers can't be separated, and therefore we can refer to study and prayer as prayer, or we can refer to study and prayer as study. The words ultimately mean the same thing. And so we stay up like Jesus to pray. We stay up to study. We stay up to meditate, to think, to make good use of the quiet hours where there are no distractions, and we can dig deeply into what it is that we're studying or meditating on or praying about. And it's the only time to do it. And so we've got this idea of keeping vigil for the sake of study. And this is the kind of thing, as I said, that Catholics don't talk about very much. They don't talk about studying through the night. They don't expect to find that others study through the night. And there's really not much study. Many excuse themselves from study because they have to work, as if men through history who studied didn't have to work. They've always had to work. Even St. Paul had to work to earn his living. So this idea that because I work, I'm therefore exempt, ignores the historical reality that these men pursued these studies and offered these prayers during the hours when others were sleeping. They did it at the expense of their sleep. So if we're going to study, we're going to need to learn to keep vigil for the sake of those studies. And so we're getting into the real work of what it means to study in the Catholic sense. Another influence that I had came from a commentary on the Rule of St. Benedict back in 2013 or so. I was invited to visit Clear Creek Abbey out in Oklahoma to talk about education. And when I was out there, I had a meeting with the abbot of the monastery, and he recommended a book to me. He might have given me the book, I don't remember. But it was a commentary on the Rule of St. Benedict. I forget the author. It was a commentary on the Rule of St. Benedict, and he gave it to me and told me he thought that while I was visiting, because I was there for at least a week, he said that he thought I would enjoy it if I read through it while I was there. And so I began doing that. During free time that I had, I began reading through this commentary, and I happened to come upon a discussion about study. And it was explaining the Benedictine motto, ora et labora, pray and work. And it was saying that normally when we think about labora, we think about manual labor. And there's sort of a grinding toil of manual labor that we think about. And that's right. That's what labor means. It means grinding toil. Not like hobby farming, not like some kind of, piddling around in the garage, but it means grinding toil. And he explained in this commentary on the Rule of St. Benedict, he explained that study is work. But there's a difference between real study and and just a love of reading, just sort of a curious surfing the web or flipping through the pages of books. That's not study. Study is real work. And he said that study can only be approved when it's pursued with the same rigor as manual labor. And when I read that, I found that so inspiring that, my studies need to be as intense as my farm work. And because I've lived on a farm, and I know what it feels like to do high pressure farm work, to gather hay when there's a storm coming, and knowing that you've got to get that hay off the ground and out of the field before sunset. That pressure to work when you're exhausted and it's hot and you're sweaty and itchy, and there's hundreds and hundreds of bales that have to be collected and put away, and the sun's going down and you're exhausted. Getting that work done, that discipline of perseverance to get that job finished. I know what it feels like to just work your hands raw in the most uncomfortable situations with this time limit just beating down upon you. And so when I'm told that study is only true study when it's pursued with the same rigor as manual labor, I say, man, I'm definitely not there yet. But we can see this message of the importance of study. That it's not some leisure activity. It's not sitting down and reading C.S. Lewis or reading G.K. Chesterton or literature. It's about formal study of the essential works, the writings of the masters. And by masters, I'm not talking about Homer and Chaucer and Shakespeare. I'm talking about Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and sacred scripture, the apostles and prophets. I'm talking real study, real necessary study, the painful kind of study. That's what we're called to. That's the work that we're called to. That's what it means to study, not leisure reading, not watching podcasts, not learning from some lazy media, but pursuing the study of real wisdom, the pursuit of real wisdom. And then in history, there was a tradition of what that meant and what that consisted of. And it was the 7 liberal arts: grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The 7 liberal arts were the curriculum for the study of the wise man. And as a man moved through the liberal arts, gained the skills necessary for the pursuit of wisdom, he then moved on into the philosophical sciences and theological sciences. And that was the course of study. That's what men worked on. That's what men studied. They started when they were 8 years old, going to grammar school, and continued in the pursuit of that learning for the rest of their lives. And modern society has almost erased the knowledge of this course of study and culture that existed all throughout history. And it's one of the things that I'm working to restore in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And so over the last 20 years or so, I've learned more and more by my research and experience. I've learned more and more about what this study consists of: the 7 liberal arts, the philosophical sciences, and theology. And that's what I've worked to make accessible and promote through the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And so I'd like to recommend that what we offer in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I think, is the course of studies that make up this true Christian study. It's the subject matter of, I should say, it's the subject matter, the only subject matter worthy of one's vigil. It's the only study that's worthy of this life that I'm talking about. It's the only study that's so important that it's worth sacrificing sleep for. It's also important to note that in the book of Proverbs, wisdom, who's presented as a woman, she says that wisdom is of greater value than money. And we can imagine avoiding study or choosing our studies in light of desire for wealth. And yet Proverbs tells us that wisdom is of greater value than material wealth. And so again, we're challenged. We're challenged to prioritize. And it's very difficult to do that. It's difficult to work and then to keep vigil. But again, one great example or model of that life that we have is St. Paul, an apostle with all the privileges of an apostle, and yet here he is working to earn his living in the New Testament. He's a great model for us of what real life consists of as a Christian, what real life actually requires. And so we're called to this study, but we've got to understand what that study is. It doesn't mean surfing the web. It doesn't mean flipping around through encyclopedias. It means the formal study of the classical liberal arts, of classical philosophy, and of Catholic theology. So I wanted to share that, first of all, because it's important to the four pillars of the lay Dominican life, but also because we've all got to think about the knowledge that's necessary for the Christian life, the wisdom that's necessary for the pursuit of happiness, and the fact that we don't have that wisdom, that wisdom has almost been lost by human society, and we have a responsibility to preserve it and enjoy it, make the most use of it, and also turn around and, as I mentioned before, solve the problems of our own generation. Not merely study and learn the history of what other men learned in the past, but to actually learn and become expert, to become prudent so that we can look upon problems in our generation and find solutions for them. That's the real challenge we face. So I'd like to encourage you, I'd like to invite you to study in this way, to make it your priority to study. I'd like to invite you to study. I'd like to encourage you to participate in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, to enroll in courses in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's intended for students of all ages. The curriculum in the program is really amazing to think about. It's so broad, so deep, so great, so pure, and filled with wisdom. I'd like to invite you to take up that study. And you can do so, as I said, by enrolling in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's very affordable, certainly worth the price, and beginning those studies. And as you begin them, you'll begin to learn why they're important, and you'll begin to see connections between different areas of study. And you'll see how really it does really come down to these few areas, these few topics of study. So I'd like to invite you to accept the challenge to pursue wisdom, to study, to keep vigil, and so on. And to be encouraged that this is really how the saints achieved the things that they did. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share about this discipline of study, about how to study, what to study, what the focus of our study should be, what study should not consist of. A lot of this modern great book stuff is really a distraction to real study, and we need to commit to it because we need to get ourselves to the next level, because there are many levels above us, and we need to get to the next level to lift up those around us. No one can give what they do not have. And as we grow in wisdom and possess wisdom, we must make a conscious effort to turn around and share the fruit of that labor with our neighbors. So, anyway, I hope that's helpful. I want to invite you to study with us. You can learn more at classicalliberarts.com. And if you've got any questions about how you can study, whether you're thinking of a child who's 7 years old or whether you're a 50-year-old man who would like to get started with studies, I encourage you to get in touch, and we can work out a plan for you, and I can help you to understand what you need to study. And I think that's the best way to go. So please consider that. Please consider the important duty of study and the means by which study is pursued. Consider the sacrificial nature of study and how it can often end in death for many, and does. And consider the importance of taking up that cross. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.